Good afternoon and welcome to Beyond the Table, a show where we sit around and we talk about the games that we love, the games that inspire me, and I have the distinct pleasure of being here with Rick Meints of Chaosium. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, JM.
This is not the first time you and I have sat down to do interviews. We've had the joy of talking several times, both here and on, at conventions and um, on Exploring Glorantha, the show that I do with Evan. So it's wonderful to be able to sit down and talk with you in another format on something that we love, because we want to talk um, about Chaosium and RuneQuest and Greg Stafford, who really is sort of this. I mean, he's still casting a shadow across gaming. Um,
He will remain a legendary figure in role-playing game and gaming history.
he
Hope
really
for
will.
a long, long time.
So you're the president of Chaosium. Do you want to, for those people who may not know who Chaosium is, give us a little overview of the company, the games you have, and the your role at the company?
Sure. Uh, I started with Chaosium in 2015, which was actually the year of the 40th anniversary of the company. And so Chaosium has been a war game and role-playing game publisher since 1975. Our first game was a war game called White Baron Red Moon,
Hmm.
and we were solely a war game publisher until a little game called RuneQuest came out in 1978. That was our first role-playing game set in the world of Glorantha, and it became the basis of the basic role-playing system, our D100 percentile system, which got used for basically all of Chaosium's games for the most part. Then we had a little RPG called Call of Cthulhu come out
Might
in
have heard about that
1981.
one.
Few people have heard the call,
Yeah.
and that was an even greater success. And so it was then used in other systems, be it Thieves World, Stormbringer, a number of other RPGs. And fast forward, we quickly became solely a role-playing game company. We've done a few small other card games, and of course we have our big Horror on the Orient Express board game coming out
Hmm.
in Kickstarter next year. But we're largely known as a gaming company, role-playing game company in particular. And I'm the president of Chaosium. As I said, I've been with Chaosium for a little over 8 years now, as of June of 2015. My day job largely evolves around a lot of administrative and production related things. I occasionally dabble into some creative efforts with the company, but I'm one of the guys that brought RuneQuest Classic back into print,
Yes.
Call of Cthulhu Classic back into print, and work with getting all of our books and games printed and shipped and so on.
So I know we said we were going to talk about it at another point, but I mean, I feel it's a great segue here. You were originally, maybe not originally, but your intersection with Glorantha professionally goes back to a company called Moon Design. That's actually how I met and got to interact with you guys originally, with the guide to Glorantha, the Glorantha Classics line, and a lot of the Hero Quest stuff. How did Moon Design come together, and then how did you guys find yourself, passing through this Hero Quest and becoming, Chaosium Reborn, if you will?
Well, Moon Design Publications came about because the Reaching Moon Megacorp, the publishers of Tales of the Reaching Moon, was largely winding things down. And it was a great magazine. We had a number of small supplements come out related to that as well. It was largely a UK-based group of people doing it, and I was, of course, living in the UK at the time. And I wanted to get more things published beyond what the Reaching Moon Megacorp wanted to do. And so one of the other Megacorp partners, so to speak, or I should say participants, it was never a real corporation, so to speak. We just called it the Megacorp to make it sound bigger than it was. But in 1998, we wanted to reprint some RuneQuest materials that had been long out of print, going back to the RuneQuest 2 era from the night. Basically, they'd all got out of print in 1983.
Hmm.
So they'd been out of print for 15 years. And so one of the other people that was part of the megacorp, who also worked with me in my day job at Ford Motor Company, uh, we decided to found Moon Design Publications to do the Gloranthan Classics, the 4-volume set that got a big chunk of all the RuneQuest 2 material back into print.
Right. So there was, you had Pavis and Big Rubble and Griffin Mountain and Borderlands and Beyond, and
And the Cult
then
Compendium,
the Cult Compendium, which was Cults of Prax and Cults of Terror, uh, kind of,
and a lot of magazine article related
yeah.
cults from different worlds, and White Wolf magazine and things like that. Uh, the thing is, Colin Phillips and I started the company, and then Colin decided to have a major change in life, and he and his wife moved to New Zealand in the year 2000. Before we had even, we had just been shipping the first book, and we're even just thinking about the second book. But he decided he wanted to just take a step back from everything, do something very different, focus on his website IT development business. And so he said, Moon Design's all yours, Rick. And so the second book, Griffin Mountain, that we did in the Gloranthan Classics series, that was just me, as was the remaining 2 volumes, Cult Compendium and then Borderlands and Beyond.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate. So I have been missing the Pavis book for years. I had a printout that I spiral bound myself, and you were kind enough to reach into the suitcase and into the stash behind you and get me a copy of Pavis. So now I have my complete Gloranthan Classics
It's a
selection on the
wonderful
shelf.
set of books.
It
I'm
is.
certainly very proud of it, and like a lot of collectors, I'm happy to help as much as I can,
Yeah.
especially if I know where there's an extra copy somewhere, or someone sells their collection and I pick up an extra copy or things like that. Always happy to get into the hands of somebody I know is going to appreciate it, like
Oh yeah.
yourself.
So you had the classics under your belt, but then we started to see new, the Sartar campaign, Sartar companion, um, the Hero Quest stuff. Now at that point, you guys, it was more than just you at that in Moon Design at that point, correct?
I was largely a one-man show until about 2005. And so the Grantham Classics had just wrapped up. And because I was regularly working with Greg, I mean, Greg had left Chaosium in 1998, and he had started his own company with all the Gloranthan IP that he took with him, Issaries Inc.
Mm-hmm.
And he published the box set Hero Wars. And then the name switched to Hero Quest when he was able to get the Hero Quest trademark after it lapsed a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, after a few years of doing all that, he was ready for a big life change himself, and he wanted to back away from doing publishing. He and his wife Suzanne moved down to Mexico and taught English as a second language. He largely left Issaries Inc. in the hands of a few other people, but it was very quickly obvious that they weren't getting the output they needed. And so that's when Moon Design offered to start publishing uh, HeroQuest supplements. Uh, things like Imperial Lunar Handbook 2,
Mm-hmm.
Blood Over Gold, some Hero Wars supplements. And we took over helping run distribution. And that quickly became too big for me as just a hobby side business. I was deep into my career at Ford Motor Company as a corporate trainer and help desk manager and such, which I realize is very different than the role playing game industry. But uh, it I was able to do it as a hobby business, but then I needed assistance. And that's where, especially after working with Jeff Richard, he came in as the other half at that time of Moon Design Publications, especially as we were gearing up to do the new Hero Quest rule book. And so then it was Jeff and I doing the work for Moon Design. And that's when we started getting into the Sartar books, Sartar
Mm-hmm.
Companion, Pavis. Those were the
Yeah.
three big, Hero Quest books that we did toward the end of, Moon Design Publications on its own.
And then you did the guide.
And then as we were gearing up, we did our first Kickstarter as a company, which was the Guide to Glorantha, which was around 2012. And that's when, as we were getting more involved and needed more assistance, we brought in Neil Robinson
Mm-hmm.
and then Michael O'Brien, kind of the tetrarchy, we call ourselves, the four main principles of moon design, the owners of moon design partners. And that's how the four of us, we had been friends long
Yeah.
before Jeff or Neil or Mob joined Moon Design. We had all met back in the 90s. I mean, I met Neil briefly and Mob briefly at RuneQuest Con 1 in Baltimore in 1994. I met Jeff very shortly after that at another RuneQuest related convention. And so we had been friends and done things like with Mob and I, we were both on the Tales of the Reaching Moon magazine. And so that was where we got to know each other a little bit, plus at all the various annual RuneQuest or Gloranthicon conventions that came out. And then Jeff and Neil were coming to those as well. They ran their own Gloranthicon in the series out in Victoria, Canada. Got to know them better. Neil and Jeff were working on their Enclosure magazine
Mm-hmm.
fan publication, which was excellent,
Mm-hmm.
with a host of other, authors and artists. And so the whole fan publishing scene allowed us to get to know each other, work with each other a little bit better. I did a little bit of helping with sales and distribution on some of those things for a number of fan publications. And so we just kept working with each other a little bit more and more until we started really getting to a larger volume of business with the Guide to Glorantha Kickstarter.
Yeah. And then in 2015, I was at the Gen Con when it got announced that you guys were going to form the new core of Chaosium leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
And
I know we have the Gloranthan Renaissance, kind of the fan renaissance that they were doing. But Evan and I have talked about it. We're getting more consistent books set in RuneQuest and Glorantha, and the quality and the beauty of the books. I mean, especially the cults books, the quality on the cults books, both the writing and the art, and the never before really seen or synthesized material we're getting in there. This is a new renaissance for Chaosium and Glorantha. Do you want to talk about how you guys kind of you know uh, came to this new role, or
well, if you rewind back to shortly before we joined the company, Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson were both very concerned
Mhm.
with the status of the Horror on the Orient Express, and also in a larger extent, the seventh edition Call of Cthulhu Kickstarter. A lot of delays, shipping
Mhm.
problems, things like that. And they were very concerned that Chaosium wasn't going to survive it.
Yeah.
And of course, Greg, the founder of Chaosium back in 1975, and Sandy Peterson, the main author for Call of Cthulhu,
Yeah.
they both, and of course, he was an employee of the company for a number of years and worked on a lot of their iconic games, including RuneQuest,
Yeah.
along with Call of Cthulhu
Yeah.
and various others. And so they both did not want to see the company potentially go bankrupt.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, they were right in their concern, because as they got more and more information, they realized it was a very precarious situation. And because I had been working with Greg in a number of financial capacities for many years, as they all, Neil, Jeff, Mob, all knew Greg very well as well.
Yeah.
Uh, and we had just done our Guide to Glorantha Kickstarter just a few years earlier, and we had fulfilled it all. And we definitely learned some lessons along the way, good and bad. It wasn't
Mhm.
like we were perfect on everything with that Kickstarter. We got a quality product out to all the backers, no doubt about that. Not, significant delays, especially for a first time Kickstarter run by a bunch of guys working out of their garage, so to speak.
Yeah.
It wasn't like game offices and a big staff and all that. It was just the four of us doing what we needed to do to get it done while we had day jobs. Jeff being a lawyer, Mob being a high level administrator at a university, Neil being, I believe at Microsoft at that time. But we all had day jobs that kept us pretty busy. Plus, everything else going on in life. But we got it done, and we also were able to put a decent bit of money into Greg's pocket in particular. We wanted to work with him more on Gloranthan things, and we actually, ended up purchasing all the rights to RuneQuest and Glorantha from him, putting more money into his pocket.
Yeah.
So he and Sandy started asking us, take a look at the Kickstarters. Let us know where the landmines are, where the biggest problems are currently, and where you think they're going to be. And they provided us, with a lot of encouragement to dig into the details, and worked with us, and we discussed it. And then we realized that a lot of shaking up needed to be done if this Kickstarter had any chance, especially the seventh edition one, had any chance of being saved and brought to completion.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of our audition to getting involved with the company and helping fix all those things. Was we first identified them and then pointed out what probably needed to be done, the best approach to get those things done.
Well, as somebody who came in to both of those projects during sort of the backer, like the right, Kickstarters have that sort of nebulous. It's not quite funded yet, but the Kickstarter's over, but you could still back and support it. I'm grateful for those. I mean, I run a lot of Call of Cthulhu 7th. I ran Horror on the Orient Express twice, I think, and they're great products. And what's always been interesting to me about Chaosium is Chaosium has bucked what seems to have been the trend for most game companies. Um, Either they have a brief bit of success and then, much like the Ottoman Empire, slowly collapse like a flan in the cupboard. Where you're like, hey, what happened to that game company? Oh, well, they went away. Or, as we've seen with sort of TSR and White Wolf, each successive generation of owners is sort of further removed from the fandom and is a much more corporate um, caretaker of the IP. But with Chaosium, the four of you came in as ground level fans to everything that Chaosium did. And I think that shows in the excitement that you guys you have for the products, in the attention to detail and the love, like wanting to produce the best version of these books going forward.
Oh yeah, no, we all have it still amazes me a little bit that Jeff, Neil, Mob, and I all have a very similar story in terms of late 70s, very early 80s. As teenagers, we got involved with role-playing games and quickly found Chaosium, mainly through RuneQuest.
Mm-hmm.
But we played Call of Cthulhu, Stormbringer, Thieves World, a lot of them as they were coming out in the early 80s, and fell in love with the company and their games. And they became our go-to company for what we largely played. Although, a lot of interest in other board games, card games that as well. But that was always kind of our deepest and longest standing love, was for Chaosium. And there are a lot of people who have a similar story like that. That is one of the reasons they've helped out Chaosium through some of the tough times. Because, while 2015 was bad, it wasn't the first time things were bad for Chaosium. Yeah. I know at that seminar you mentioned at Gen Con that, Greg was one of the main, or at least he kicked it off, and history. And he said, like, the company almost went bankrupt 3 times. And he talked about each of those times, be it in the early 80s or the late 80s, or then with the Mythos crash in the 90s, that was part of him leaving the company. Yeah. He said he didn't want it to happen a 4th time. And, part of the reason it hadn't gone bankrupt in those earlier times is a lot of fans stood by him, a lot of people willing to loan the company money or help out with assistance, anything they could, just keep the company limping along until things turned around. Yeah. And so we're in some ways just the 4th recovery version of that company problem of feast or famine. Yeah. And the one thing that I believe my partners and I bring to the table is we all had a lot of business experience that we brought to the company. Not to say we aren't creative people, because we are, especially my partners are more than I am. But still, Chaosium didn't have as many people with business skills working for the company as much as it had creative geniuses like Greg Stafford, or editing and other geniuses like Lynn Willis, who that's what they brought to the table. They weren't primarily business people. Greg would, readily admit he didn't enjoy spending time on it. He would do it if he had to, but working on the finances, the taxes, the accounting, or whatever, that wasn't his passion. Right. That wasn't his strength. and he was very comfortable having people, especially the partners in Moon Design, get involved to focus on all that and have it become less of an ongoing issue. And the results, we got the 7th edition Kickstarter finished. We wrapped up the shipping on Horror on the Orient Express. We've had, like you said, a lot of products coming out that have won a number of awards and have been well received. And so the company is on a much better financial footing. Still got things to fix,
Oh,
always things to
there's
improve
always
on,
things to fix. Yeah.
but it beats worrying about whether you're going to go out of business next month.
Oh yeah. I mean, again, and going back to just the cults books that are coming out, and the fact that this wasn't, when this was announced, this wasn't at some point in the far future, right? 4 of the cults books were done by the end of the year, and it is a great time to be a Call of Cthulhu fan and to be a Glorantha fan. Uh, Speaking of fans, Jorg says hello. He's in here. Said hi to Rick and myself. Nice to see you,
That's
Jorg.
if that's Jorg B, then hello, Jorg. Always a pleasure. Had a feeling you might be tuning in.
So let's, now that we've got kind of our introductory um, discussion out of the way. Oh, and Evan is in the chat as well. Good to see Evan.
Wonderful. Always
My,
good to have Evan around.
that's right, my co-host on Exploring Glorantha.
I just like to say one thing before we dive right
Sure.
in. We've got RuneQuest on a very solid footing with a lot of books, more cults books coming out, along with various source books like the Dragon Pass book and so on. We obviously have Call of Cthulhu supplements, both solos, big campaigns, smaller campaigns, source books coming out. But we're relaunching Pendragon. We had the starter set come out, and very early in 2024, just a few months from now, we're going to have the core rule book come out, and we're going to have the Grey Knight campaign come out. And so we're getting, if you've seen the starter set and how beautiful it is,
gorgeous,
especially with the artwork and the graphic design, Sim has totally knocked it out of the park on that side of it. Working with David Larkins, it's beautiful. It's very true to the previous editions of the game because it was all written by Greg Stafford and worked with David Larkins to get it edited and all tightly packaged up. And so it's great to have Pendragon on that list of getting back into a new renaissance of the game as well.
I mean, and there are so many other great Chaosium products that I'm not going to put you on the spot, but you mentioned some of them, like Stormbringer. Nephilim was one that I still have all of my Nephilim books. Well, actually, I have Evan's Nephilim books. He was kind enough to rehome them for me. There's a great wealth of wonderful games and properties that Chaosium has either created or been steward of over the years that I'm hoping the vault opens on at some point in the future.
Well, we did RuneQuest Classic and Call of Cthulhu Classic, and we intend on doing more of those type of things, along with trying to, if we have the rights and it makes sense, we want to bring back some of those older game lines that we don't feel just need to be in an edition from 20 or 30 years ago and haven't had much come out since.
Well, let's get to the meat of why we had talked about doing this Beyond the Table, which I always like to lead in with the quote. John Wick, the game designer, has said many times, if you've come up with something, some cool new mechanic in role-playing games, check your history. I'm paraphrasing, right? Greg Stafford probably invented it and probably explained it a lot better than you, 40 years ago. And I cannot express how much just Greg Stafford's works have meant to me. I mean, I've only got to meet him a handful of times, and he was always just this engaging and generous soul. And when he talked with you, it sort of felt like, even though I was on the floor of, I was in a convention hall or I was on the floor of the dealer room at Gen Con, when Greg talked with you, it was as if you were the only person in that space. I mean, he was 100% focused on just engaging with you as a human being, and it was wonderful.
And I've described him this way before, but I still feel it's as apt as always, which is Greg had a natural charisma of 18, and he was always made time for everybody as much as he could. Always happy to talk and listen as well. It wasn't just all, let me just tell you a story and he would, it was an interaction. It was a conversation, not just a speech he was giving whenever people were talking with him. He
Yeah.
was not just talking at them.
Yeah.
And, we've all met people that kind of talk at you. And Greg was not one of those people
Yeah.
at all.
Um, so I ended up having this, I try not to get in arguments on the internet. But there was this one time where I had to because um, somebody was talking about how everything was a derivative of D&D, and I was like, well, you can't make that argument because, right, RuneQuest, if anything, was a reaction to D&D, not a derivative of it. But RuneQuest is, Glorantha existed long before this hobby that we are now engaged in
Oh
um,
yeah.
was there. So what can you share about maybe what maybe Greg has told you or stories that you've heard of a young Greg Stafford discovering Glorantha? And I've also heard, can you put to rest the rumor, did Greg own one of the first copies of Dungeons and Dragons? I've heard he had a friend who was at
Oh,
a print shop. I think you'll know the
well,
story better than I'll turn
I,
this over.
I love the story that Greg tells,
Yeah.
and he told it regularly. But I'm part of a collecting community
Mm-hmm.
of, they're not only collectors, but they're also historians. And the very first printing, the wood grain box of Dungeons and Dragons, wasn't collated at the printer. They had the boxes printed separate from the booklets, separate
Mm-hmm.
from the handouts. And as I understand it, they were all collated in Gary Gygax's basement at his house. And
Okay.
so if you were at the printer, they may have had a stack of boxes there, or they may have had some booklets. But to have, the
It
games
all
quote
assembled.
unquote all, at least for the first printing.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of interesting alignment between what Greg was doing in his life, and he basically worked for a company around 1975ish for the Bergamont Brass Works, and basically he was a traveling salesman selling a bunch of their belt buckles and other similar items. A lot of the eastern states, Pennsylvania and so on, he would go around to various shops and was selling their works. And so he was going to and from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, or very close to it, where the Bergamont Brass Works were. That's why Greg occasionally makes in Gloranthan jokes about belt buckle salesman from I think it's Rendlady or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's a quick wink to his time working for the Bergamont Brass Works. And so, but realistically, he he did not have a first printing, first one ever. It was probably he had, I think it was his buddy was there when they were collating all the like third or fourth printings and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And that's more realistically the first copy he got of the game, not a first print, which there were only 1,000 of.
Right. It was a very narrow. Also, hello to Oz, who's a good friend of mine in the shows. Good to see you on there. Um, so Greg always said he discovered Glorantha, and you've had the opportunity or had the opportunity to sit down and talk a lot about stuff like this with Greg. So
I,
how did that all come together?
I was very fortunate that, when I first met him, and I was absolutely nobody at GloranthaCon 1 in Baltimore, but I brought a comic book box full, a lot of my game collection, RuneQuest collection, I should say. And I just wanted to chat with him about it. And I managed to catch him in between events and all that. And he spent over half an hour to an hour of his time just chatting with me, looking at things. I could ask him questions. He would bring up anecdotes or talk about various things. And of course, I got him to autograph a bunch of it because I was super into that. And, you know, so going back to then, he was always happy to talk about the origins of Glorantha and the company. And then, of course, every convention, especially the Gloranthan ones that he went to, there was always a seminar on the
Mm-hmm.
Greg gets to talk about, whatever, he wants to, but also he would let people ask questions a lot more about the early days of Glorantha. But yeah, back in his time at Beloit College, starting in about 1966, when he was a freshman, he was a cheap date. He thought that telling stories to who he was dating was an easy way to be entertaining without having to pay for movies or things like that. And so he started coming up with fictional stories that he kept all of his notes. He going back to the very first snippets that he wrote, and then the larger stories, he kept it all in notebooks and held on to it. up till the end of his life.
Mm.
And we actually have a lot of that in the archives now.
Oh, wow. And so as he was just telling stories, did the narrative, did he need a place to set his stories?
It quickly became set in what he called the world of Glorantha. And, within a couple of years of him writing the stories, he dropped out of college after just a couple of years and then started, hitchhiking out west and kind of became a classic San Francisco hippie. And then he realized a few years later he was going to need to have a job. And so, then he started working for staffing company, the one that sell temp, they
hmm
rent out temps, to various companies. He didn't enjoy that and didn't stick with it for,
I
I don't.
couldn't imagine him enjoying something like that.
No, but he had to get a
Yeah.
job,
Yeah.
he was happy he didn't get drafted
hmm
during the Vietnam War. Uh, that's one of the reasons when he dropped out of college, he was a bit nervous he'd have to go, but he never got called up. Um, that's why he drank black coffee till the end of his life, is because he thought he was going to end up going to Vietnam. And so he's like, I better get used to drinking black coffee because I probably can't get cream and sugar all the time for my coffee. And so that's how he learned to enjoy coffee the best. And so he had black coffee.
It is the best way to enjoy coffee.
Yeah, I am sure some people uh, agree with that.
Yeah.
But me, I like milk in my coffee. But anyway, uh, so he kept writing stories, because his college notebooks, which we have some doodles and short snippets about high level mythology or things loosely set in Glorantha, but it was still all just prototype ideas, brief things that got rewritten. And like the first story about Delecti is not about Delecti the necromancer in the upland marsh. He just used that name in a story and then changed it and developed the character an awful lot more. That's
Kept
very true
ruminating
for,
on it and returning to it.
and it really wasn't until he when he started working on the White Bear and Red Moon war game
hmm
in the early 70s, that's when Glorantha as a world with a more detailed map and more set concepts started coming into being.
So, what made Greg decide that he wanted to do a board game, and specifically White Bear Red Moon?
Well, he started the idea of having a war game because there were no role-playing games in the very early 70s.
Right.
Greg was mainly an Avalon Hill wargamer. He played, U-Boat and Tractix 2 and a lot of other
hmm
Avalon Hill war games, or other smaller publishers as well. But those are the ones that leap to mind immediately. But that's he, like many people who got into role-playing games, if they were playing games before Dungeons and Dragons came out, it was all war games, miniatures, and the classic hexes with paper chits.
hmm
And
I still
so,
have my copy of Omaha Beachhead around here, and it has the distinction of being the first and last board game I got my father to try because it took us about 90 minutes to set up all the chits, and he was like, "I'm done. I'm out." I'm like, "But we just set it up."
yeah, well, the top shelf of my shelves
hmm
is largely all full of SPI and similar war games because, before I played, a lot of role playing games, I was playing Avalon Hill games like Panzer Blitz, Panzer Leader, Rise and Decline of the Third Reich, things like that, playing some Starfleet battles as well in the mix. Although, obviously by the time D&D came out, I was 9 years old, so role playing games were on the scene when I started playing more advanced board games.
Right. And so he decided that this was the way that he wanted to um, share Glorantha with the world. And so
Mm-hmm.
he starting to put this war game together.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dungeons and Dragons comes on the scene. And I've always imagined that it was the storytelling component of role playing games that appealed to Greg as a way to share his world. Is that a fair assessment?
I yeah, I think so. I mean, he didn't specifically talk with me in detail about what made him switch, but Greg's always been a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to be a fiction writer. We have a lovely folder based on, because he kept them all, we have a folder full of his rejection letters from when he tried to write fiction for various magazines. Even like chili recipes for Good Housekeeping magazine and Better Homes and Gardens, or he had some Norse fiction related to, Thor and the other,
Hmm.
pantheon of Ragnarok and all that. They had tried. So he was a frustrated fiction writer who didn't have a lot of success doing that. And so, since he couldn't be at least he couldn't find a way to make money as a fiction writer other than he wrote articles in some magazines that got published. Um, he wanted to give publishing his own war game a try.
And it went well, from what I understand. Like, it's kind of what started Chaosium and put it on the map.
Yes, I mean he had tried to get it published through other existing publishers at that time, because Craig wasn't a guy who was like, oh, I'm just dying to set up my own business. He want, like, when he was a fiction author or trying to become a fiction author, he was submitting it to all the big publications and publishing houses. He was doing the same thing with White Bear and Red Moon. He got a publisher to accept it, but then that publisher went out of business. Very small time publisher, but still, uh, after 3 attempts at getting other publishers to do his work, and either having those companies fail or reject it or whatever, he did a tarot card reading, and it said, the card said to him, save your money for a year, start your own company and publish it yourself. And so that's what he decided to do.
That is
That's when
the most Greg Stafford story. Although Ben has a point, we need Greg Stafford's chili recipe put up on Chaosium's website.
if I can find it, like, we have the rejection letter, but I don't, it doesn't always include the articles, but if I find it, yes, I will put the chili recipe.
That
We'll blog about it and get the chili recipe onto the
that would be amazing.
website.
Like, I think that week, a ton of Stafford's chili will be made just kind of throughout the world. So he decides to start this company, and then it sort of, in some ways, crystallized a lot of the mythology of Glorantha. As you said, he was kind of, recapitulating it, reworking it, but once you publish something, I mean, you can change within certain variances, but right, it's the thing that, when something's an oral tradition, it can
Can morph.
evolve and morph, but as soon as it gets written down, things start getting locked in stone.
Uh, More in stone, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Although Greg was quite comfortable changing his mind on a number of things over the decades, even relatively recently, where he just thought it through more in depth based on a lot of conversations, maybe even some shaman hero questing type of things,
Hmm.
sweat lodges or whatever, and things he wanted to do things differently. And he was not that reluctant to say, okay, I may have been saying it's this way for the last 20 years, but I'm willing to, retcon it or change it based on what he felt was more true to the subject and was more fun, or, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and something that always struck me is Greg never said that he created or he invented Glorantha. He always said he discovered it. And the only other writer that I've ever really encountered who speaks about his works like that is Stephen King. Right? Stephen King, when talking about the Dark Tower, which is his sort of, framework for all of his other stories, or his magnum opus, however you want to describe it, he always is like, I can't write these books until the key in my head, until I whittle a key in my head and it opens the door into Roland's world and I'm able to observe what's going on there. I didn't write the Dark Tower. I've sort of, I'm just transcribing what I've seen. And Greg kind of talked about Glorantha the same way.
Yeah. I mean, he, as I briefly said, he was a shaman,
Mm-hmm.
and he did a lot of sweat lodges, journeys to the other side, those type of things, where he was reaching out to some greater consciousness throughout his whole life, and that journey never ended. And so, a lot of the people that know him the best think he's just on that one last great spiritual journey out there, and he's finding whatever ways he can to communicate with us or things like that. But he always tapping into that, and that's where a lot of his ideas came from. It wasn't just I just sat down and invented it.
Yeah, I wrote out.
Although there are some things he kind of invented for very mundane reasons,
Yeah.
be it looking on a shelf and needing a name for a port city, and he saw the bottle of correction fluid on a shelf, and so he named that city Corfu. There are little things like that that'll be happy to say that, oh yeah, I just made that up because people were pushing me to name something. But a lot of especially a lot of the greater concepts and all that, though, that was all from his explorations
Yeah.
and so on. It wasn't just the mundane sitting down in front of a typewriter.
So he's got this board game, and role playing games come on the scene. And I mean, especially that zero, the wood grain box D&D set is probably the least like a rule set that any modern gamer would ever even consider, right? It is this very, I've always described it as it's more of the idea of a game. And once you wrap your head around that idea, every table was completely different because you had these
Oh
different
yeah.
interpretations of these very loose frameworks, and you kind of had to understand how where D&D was coming from out of chainmail and wargaming to kind of fill in the pieces.
Oh yeah.
And oh, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, Greg was part of a very active fanzine community at that time. You don't hear the term so much anymore, but amateur press associations,
Mm-hmm.
APAs,
Yeah.
basically people would type up 2, 4, 6, 8 pages of material, and they'd submit it to an editor who would then do this, assemble, collate all the contributions from a variety of people, because these were monthly publications, and they would then, bind them, print extra copies, and mail them out to all the contributors plus some subscribers. And very quickly after Dungeons and Dragons came out in 74, especially like 75, 76, all these APAs started talking about variants and
Mm-hmm.
expansions, and this was missing from the rules and they wanted to add it. And Greg was a very active part of the APA zine. He had his own weird magazine that he was part of. He was first a contributor to it and then became one of the publishers of it. It's one of those kind of semi-forgotten, really early Chaosium related efforts that he did, that he largely gave up on that as Chaosium took all of his time.
Mm-hmm.
But he formed 3 companies when he started Chaosium, and one of them was with Weird Magazine, one was his wood carving business, and the third was Chaosium.
I did not know that. I didn't even know he had a wood carving business.
I wish I had one super handy because I have a few in my collection. But yeah, he one of the things, one of his creative outlets, because Greg was a very creative person in a number of ways. One of his creative outlets was hardwood carvings of various, uh, sometimes mythological creatures. He did a detailed map of Hyperborea. He A lot of them were circular, about yay big, about 6 inches in diameter. One of them is a very early Celtic dragon, which looks an awful lot like the Chaosium logo we know and love today.
Oh, it's
But
awesome.
he didn't carry on that business very long. But yeah, he did wood carving for a while, and it was just one of his many creative outlets.
Well, and speaking of his, the APAs, Chaosium is released, which very hopeful from the title, right? The Stafford campaign, Volume One, which includes a lot of Greg's articles from things like Alarms and Excursions and other publications
Wild Hunt. Mhm.
detailing that original conversation. And that's the thing that is sometimes, especially kind of now, almost almost 50 years out from the origins of this hobby. It's sort of like in writing into Dragon Magazine and having Gary answer your questions or interact with you about, you know, your AD&D game. Greg was very, very active in these early APAs and talking about his game. I remember reading through the Stafford campaign, and somebody was like, "Well, hey, here's how I'm doing it in my game," and Greg was like, "That's brilliant. I think we're gonna put that in RQ too." And I was like,
Oh yeah, no, yeah, he was a prolific letter writer. He was a fantastic typist, because most of the letters that we have in the archives are all typed by Greg.
Okay.
And so he, like many people of that era, they were very willing and write all kinds of letters, especially if someone mailed them a letter with feedback. They would usually immediately type a letter back saying thank you and respond to whatever criticism, feedback, suggestions, compliments were in there. And so he was very happy to share ideas and get ideas. He was not like, no, I got my ideas. I don't need any help from anybody else. He was a very collaborative person. And that, I think a lot of that comes out of just the whole APA, era, starting in really 76. Early 76 is when a lot of them really started in terms of role-playing material, all about D&D variants and all that. And it was in July of 1976 that he and a number of other gamers in the San Francisco area, that's when they decided they wanted to come up with their own role-playing game that handled mechanics and such very differently than Dungeons and Dragons. It was not like a let's make it a D&D killer or anything. It's just like, let's make a game that we want to enjoy, that focuses on what we want to enjoy, the way we want to enjoy it. And so in July of 76, that's when they started working on RuneQuest. And then just shy of 2 years later, it was published.
Well, and that's, what's interesting to me about those early years is that we very quickly see kind of the main three types of broad categories of games, ways to adjudicate rules and to make characters, right? You have D&D comes out with pick a class and go, which is still one of the main ways of enjoying gaming today. Traveler does, hey, here's a life path system. Let's take you through this life path system, and then now you've made your character. Now use that character to go on and explore. But as you said, by 77, 78, we have our first real skill focused, classless game out there that, like, hey, we're gonna, it's not gonna be archetype abilities. It's not going to be based off all this other stuff. It's, hey, you're going to have a character who has skills, and that's what's going to go forward. I actually just finished a reread of the BRP, the new version of BRP that you guys put out, which if you are a game designer, do yourself a favor, go pick up that book right there, because it is a masterclass on how to put together a game system, and with all the optional rules. And yeah, so, I mean, this is the foundation of, as you said, RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and Nephilim and all of the Chaosium families. Now, Steve Perrin was involved in that, correct?
Steve Perrin was one of the principal authors of RuneQuest. Yes. On the mechanics side, it was Steve Perrin and Ray Turney.
Right.
Ray Turney, sorry, Turney. And they had a number of other play testers as well. Greg was mainly there, not only playtesting stuff, but also just adding the Gloranthan information into the book.
And the touches, making sure that it fit as well as it could.
But yeah, no, I mean, the two principal authors on the cover are Steve Perrin and Ray Turney.
Right. And very quickly we got RQ2. I assume it's because it was doing so well that it sold out, and it was a time to do some updates and move forward.
Well, RuneQuest first edition had one printing, 5,000 copies. And very quickly, fans were, especially back then, were very happy to tell you what they did or didn't like with the game. And because a lot of people didn't have a lot of experience developing role-playing games. I mean, the first one came out in late 74. So it's not like, in my 20 years of designing role-playing games, there was no such thing. Maybe war game rules, sure. And that's why there is a certain simulationist angle to many of the early role-playing games, because that's where the people with the most experience they drew from. But June of 78, RuneQuest 1 comes out, at Origins 78, and over the next 6 months they got lots of feedback on mistakes as simple as typos. I mean, they misspelled the name of the company on the back cover, Chaosium, and things like that. There were a lot of holes in the rules. A lot of questions got answered and asked. And so they very quickly realized that they needed to do a second edition, a revised edition. And so in 79, that second edition came out. They basically were selling out of the first print run. And they're like, yeah, let's just let that one go and we'll get all set up. When we reprint, we're going to be doing a second edition of the game.
which is really where, I mean, that's where I got into RuneQuest. I think that's where most of the RuneQuest fans really got into and fell in love with the game, was during the RQ2 era. I mean, we don't have to talk about RQ3. I still have my RQ3 books on the shelf, but I think RQ2 stands as the, well, you are Mr. Suitcase. If I had something that you did, I would feel morally obligated to send it to you.
Well, thank you. I've had a number of friends and colleagues who have said, I want this in the collection.
Yeah.
So they sent me things.
So Greg still, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but I know Greg still was tinkering on, he was running RuneQuest, he was playing RuneQuest in Glorantha, but it never, he kept wanting to do more and like find a rule set. I mean, obviously he went on to do what became HeroQuest. Do you know what it was about RuneQuest that Greg still felt like it needed to be pushed further? Was it really the hero questing side of things, or was it more of the narrative side of things?
Well, Greg started working on hero questing rules fairly early on and advertised it in Worms Footnotes
I
magazine
remember that.
as coming soon or
Mm-hmm.
next year. And that's kind of where the whole joke about Chaosium using the when something coming out is next year.
Mm-hmm.
And
When will that be now? Soon.
yeah, yeah. For us, it was always next year.
Yeah.
But Greg struggled with coming up with hero questing rules that not only worked, but weren't some heavy duty accounting system which sucked all the fun out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of people who worked on it with him always said the same thing. It's that you want it to be this epic, high level storytelling system that allows you to do great deeds and, turn the world upside down or whatever. But as they tried to come up with mechanics that would do that, it just kept taking away from all that high level type of thing. And so there are several drafts of various hero quest manuscripts and so on, but most of them, there was not a coherent game ever there. And so he kind of set that aside, but there were a lot of revisions that he was gearing up to include in RuneQuest that they were playing around with, like in the Griffin Mountain supplement, which came out in 1981. There was a personality sheet which had traits on it for whether you were more generous or selfish or things like that. It's an NPC personality sheet which added a new spin on RuneQuest. They tried it out in that, but shortly thereafter, they started doing the deal with Avalon Hill for a new edition of the game. And then they had to focus on that, and they kind of set things into stone while Greg was still working on some of these prototype ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of prototype ideas that Greg wanted to put into RuneQuest, he really couldn't do it with the RuneQuest third edition that Avalon Hill was going to do because he didn't want to slow things down.
Right.
And they ended up going into a little game we all know and love called Pendragon.
Yeah. Which, man, Pendragon still sits as one of those high watermarks in gaming history. Like, I know when I was writing Jackals, I wanted the game to feel where the system and the world were just so seamlessly merged, and I wanted a grand campaign. That's where Fall of the Children of Bronze came. But like Pendragon and the Great Pendragon cycle, adventure, the Great Pendragon campaign were the things that I just kept taking off the shelf and looking at and poring over, because it is this, for me, perfect synthesis of every mechanic ties back to a very important part of the world building.
As a game designer, in terms of his game designer wearing that hat, Pendragon is the game he was always most proud of.
Yeah,
because that's the one that he did far more work on the rules, and he thought it really captured the setting and what the goals of the characters were. And so that's why, I mean, he loved many, or most, if not all, of his creations. It was just the Pendragon he was most proud of his role as a game designer.
so what was it about the Arthurian cycle that so captured Greg's mind and heart and imagination?
Ooh, that's a big subject. um, you know, it
Interview two. No.
well, he loved, it was he loved Lamort d'Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
He was, a voracious reader. And if you look in the back of the early RuneQuest books, when he had inspirational sources listed in there, there were always Arthurian sources
Mm-hmm.
listed in there, including Lamort d'Arthur. He loved the Tales of the Round Table. He liked the Prince Valiant comic, all those kind of things. And, he especially liked kind of the mythology that surrounded it. Greg was very much into mythology. It didn't matter what it was, but he was always interested in that exploration of it. And that was
Mm-hmm.
Pendragon allowed him to do that with the Arthurian mythos, so to speak.
I have an article coming out in a book that's coming out, I hope, next year. I submitted my article, so I have all control that I have. My part of the process is done. But the book is called, I believe it's called The Golden Key: Recovering the Sacred Imagination. And I wrote an article uh, about role playing games as sort of a type of liturgy where we all sit together and we kind of experience uh, a different type of time and a different type of interaction. And man, the paper is rife with quotes from Greg, from interviews, and from um, just, the Stafford library that you guys had published, the Book of Hjortling Mythology, and that he got the symbolism and the importance of mythology at a time when a lot of people were just wanting to push all of that to the side as like, you know, bunk or not important, or from a more, if you will, primitive mindset. And he's like, no, this is right. He talks about, the quote that I love is, and I'm gonna misquote it, so I'm gonna paraphrase it instead, is that role playing is an activity that taps into our mythological side and feeds our souls. Like it
Yeah.
shows us how to be human. And I
Mhm.
loved that about his, he was very concerned with what it meant to be human, and I loved that about him.
Yeah. Some foundational beliefs in being a member of a tribe.
Mm-hmm.
We are all us.
Yeah.
Community and storytelling and mythology, all being a part of that. That was all the things that were a big part of Greg's, life.
Yeah. Um, well, let's take a kind of a detour. I'm gonna save my last couple of questions here. I know we have a kind of a hard limit here in about a half hour, so let's take a slight detour, because at some point Greg is running Chaosium. RuneQuest is doing well, and what's the story behind Sandy doing Call of Cthulhu? Because I mean, at the time, Lovecraft was known by about this many people. I think we could honestly say that the Call of Cthulhu role playing game is one of the reasons that Lovecraft is as and the Cthulhu mythos are as widely known today as they are.
It was a big contributor to that.
Yeah.
Not the only one, but it was a big contributor to it. Most people hadn't, read much H.P. Lovecraft
Mm-hmm.
or knew much about the whole Cthulhu mythos before Call of Cthulhu came on the scene. It was
Right.
certainly a smaller market than it is today. Uh, you know, so how did Call of Cthulhu come about?
Yeah.
Is that what
Did Sandy sell Greg on the idea of doing Call of
Well,
Cthulhu? Was it?
ultimately, but to rewind a little bit, Steve Lortz, who also did a few other projects with Chaosium, including the wonderful little pocket game Panzer Pranks, he was interested in doing a more general horror game for Chaosium. And he wanted to include elements of the Cthulhu mythos in it. Steve had even been corresponding with Arkham House, the
Mm-hmm.
IP holders at that time. This is like 1979. He was writing letters to Arkham House trying to get a deal where they would be able to, Steve would be able to license the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu Mythos IP for a role playing game. And of course, it was a little bit of a lengthy negotiation process because Arkham House was great as a, oh, you want to do a fiction book? something else in the, oh, you want to write another Innsmouth book or whatever. They could find a way to cut a fiction deal quite easily, but a role-playing game deal was kind of out of their wheelhouse, and they weren't really sure what to do with it. So they kind of went slowly. They weren't saying no, they just wanted to really think it through before they signed a deal. And then because Steve Lortz had been working with Chaosium, Greg in particular, and Lynn Willis as well, because I know we have a number of letters between Steve Lortz and Lynn Willis, and with a little bit of Greg in there too, that Steve's Dark Worlds manuscript was what Chaosium was working on. It was not based on BRP or the RuneQuest mechanics, which all there really was at that time was the RuneQuest mechanics. It was just a totally different system. And as Chaosium got more and more interested in publishing Dark Worlds, they had just come out with Basic RuneQuest, which became that 16 little page BRP booklet, basic role playing.
Mm-hmm.
And they really wanted to base their games off of that. They thought it'd be a lot better to not be a publisher of 5 or 6 different role playing games someday with all totally different systems. Why can't they just take the basic rules, which they thought were really simple to understand, and use it as the basis of any role-playing game they were going to do, just tweak it for whatever the genre needed.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tried to talk Steve into basically scrapping a lot of his rules and doing a BRP version of Dark Worlds instead. And it was around that time that Sandy Peterson, who had been already working on a number of RuneQuest products, and working with Greg, we did the Gateway Bestiary and
Mm-hmm.
things like that with Chaosium. He's like, I think we should do basically a RuneQuest Cthulhu game based mainly on H.P. Lovecraft stuff. That's what he pitched, and that's what became known as Call of Cthulhu. And so Steve's project got just shelved. They had, didn't make a deal, didn't publish anything with it, and they went with Sandy's idea instead. And it became largely an in-house thing with Sandy working with Lynn Willis as the main editor to come up with. They took the basic role-playing book. If you bought first edition Call of Cthulhu, first printing, it had the BRP rule book as part of the package because you had to use that to help create your characters, and then you would add on other things in the supplemental book. And that was kind of the approach Chaosium wanted for all their games. Starts with BRP, and here's what we're adding to it.
Mm-hmm. Which is essentially what the current BRP book that you just showed is. It says, hey, here's the baseline rules, and then here are all of these optional rules and systems that you can put on top of it to make your game a little bit more like RuneQuest or a little bit more like Call of Cthulhu or Superworld.
Yeah, they're all in the same vein, using the same core rules,
Yeah.
just adapting it, modifying it, adding to it for what best fits the genre.
All right. So let me ask, because another um, fictional world that I became very enamored with because of Chaosium's involvement with it is the Michael Moorcock Eternal Champion stuff. So Stormbringer, Corum, Hawkmoon, the Eternal Champion. How did that all come together? Like, was that a Greg thing? Was that somebody coming and saying, "Hey, BRP would be a good fit for this"? Because I mean, mythologically, there's a lot of strong. Uh, let's just say it's in the same vein as a lot of the stuff that Chaosium was already doing.
Well, Greg and Michael Moorcock via Chaosium started working together on the Elric war game. That was published in
Yeah.
1977. And that was what they thought would work best for the genre to begin with, battle at the end of time type of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so that was their first project together. And then that was before RuneQuest was published in 78. And so it was, not until 1981, the same year that Call of Cthulhu came out, that Stormbringer came out.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Ken St. Andre
Yep.
and a number of other related authors working on it. And so that's when, so it was the success of the Elric board game, all the mechanics that go into a licensing deal and it working well. It was fine with the Elric game, so they expanded the rights for role playing games, and that's when Stormbringer came out in '81.
So my first introduction to Elric was through I don't remember what edition of Stormbringer it was, but I mean,
Box set or book?
I think it was a box set,
1 inch or 2 inch?
1 inch. There you go. I'm talking to Mr. Suitcase,
It's the third edition more
third
than that.
edition. Um, and I mean, that hit at all the right moments for a young JM between, you know, Stormbringer and then reading the books and then Blue Oyster Cult being introduced to by a friend. And they're like, well, if you like this, then you'll like, these guys.
Sure,
They,
sure.
they wrote songs about, um, and Moorcock worked with them on some of the lyrics for, I think it was Veteran of the Psychic Wars.
Michael Moorcock loved working with bands, probably most famously for Hawkwind,
Mm-hmm.
working with them, but they were not the only ones as well.
Yeah.
Michael Moorcock has a wide variety of interests and creative outlets, including music.
He is an interesting fellow, and someday I hope I get to meet him as well because he definitely has influenced my writing and my gaming and just a lot of different tastes in my life.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've never met him either, so I look forward to the first time I get to meet him.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll just get him to a Chaosium con and then we can just say it happened at the same time. It'll be perfect. You heard it here, folks. No promises or guarantees at all. I'm just throwing things out there.
Yeah, we Chaosium Con next April. It'd be very doubtful we would have Michael Moorcock.
Yeah. Hopefully Evan and I will be able to make it to Chaosium Con again. That first one was something special. Like if
Well, we hope you do come back.
Yeah. So, all right, let's finish up here with a couple of so for you, what is your favorite part of Greg's influence on Chaosium? Whether it's a book, whether it's a specific part of Glorantha, whether it's like what's your favorite contribution that Greg has made to gaming and why?
Greatest contribution to gaming. I'd say that he's done so many
I know,
things.
I know it. It's a
I
difficult question.
I I think that he was always trying to get more people involved and encouraging them to follow whatever their passion was
Hmm.
in getting involved, be it as a writer, an artist, an editor. Uh, for me, like doing layout for books, because that's how I got started, was doing layout for magazines and then the classics and things like that. But he was always incredibly encouraging about you finding your passion related to gaming. And I've heard that story from a lot of people, is that he was always incredibly supportive. I mean, Reed Hoffman, 12 years old, shows up in the Chaosium office with a bunch of notes on how he wanted to change things in various RuneQuest things. And they offered him a job working on the Borderlands supplement.
That's
And,
amazing.
he was convinced that, Reed was convinced that, oh, they'll never listen to a kid like me, because his mom was typing up his stuff for him because he didn't really know how to type at that point. And he thought, well, if I don't have it typed up, they won't treat me as professionally. So his mom helped him with that. But, you know, to Greg, if you had a passion and wanted to add that passion to whatever was involved in gaming, he was going to encourage it.
Well, and you said something earlier about him being a very collaborative, focused person, right? One of the phrases we have now in the Gloranthan genre is your Glorantha may vary,
Sure.
and there was never any attempt from at least what I saw to say, no, this is it. This is the way it is. It was, I want to share in this with you. And if you've got a good idea, I definitely want to hear it and I definitely want to incorporate it.
Yeah, no, at a lot of seminars that Greg used to, especially the Gloranthan conventions, where he tended to get some real hardcore Gloranthan grognards. And I say that with respect because they have
Mm-hmm.
passion for the game. They definitely have passion for the game. And I consider a lot of them my friends to this day, after, like 25, going on 30 years almost of being a part of the, Gloranthan fan community, RuneQuest fan community. And they would throw out ideas And Greg would say, well, I don't know if I would write it that way, but you're welcome to write it up that way. Kind of agree to disagree respectfully. So he wouldn't just drop everything he was doing when somebody came up with a different idea, but he was very open to, like, yeah, explore it that way for yourself. If that's
Yeah,
how it works for you, it's more important that it works for you than it works for me.
that is a an attitude I think that even beyond gaming we could use more of. A a very kind of humble and respectful, even if it's a disagreement. Just a like you said, Greg saw everybody as human, and just wanted to like engage with them. And even if he didn't agree with them, it was interesting to having sat in some of those seminars. It was one of the things I loved about Greg.
Yeah. He was very encouraging of the whole fan publications scene, be it Tales of the Reaching Moon or Trade Talk and Closure, RuneQuest Adventures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He was always very supportive of those things, where he would often write an article for him just to help him get some, attention in their
Yeah,
early issues. Like, hey, we got an article by Greg and lots of other people writing other stuff too. But it was,
right.
that headline of, oh, Greg wrote something, that made a lot of people go out and buy it just for that. And then
Right. Come for Greg, stay for everybody else. But
exactly. And Greg was happy to help, make those publications get a wider audience, just because he really wanted. I mean, that's how he got his start, writing
right.
for very small publications like Weird Magazine and a few others like that back in the 70s.
So I realize this may be another very difficult question on a lot of different levels, but um, thinking back over all the years you got to work with Greg and um, hang out with Greg, you and I've talked about the times that he would come and stay with you for a while, and
Oh yeah,
before heading
every
down
year.
to a convention, or you would go out to visit him and his family.
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite Greg Stafford memory?
Oh,
I realize just with your relationship with Greg, one, there's going to be a lot, and two, there's going to be a lot of emotions that kind of come up with it.
they certainly could.
Yeah,
There's certainly stories that I've told about Greg that I really enjoy telling, that they definitely bring a tear to my eye, and I start to get all sentimental and emotional, because he was one of my great friends
hmm,
and somebody I miss tremendously. It's hard to believe he's been gone over 5 years now.
yeah,
And, I got to see him shortly before he passed away. Um, in general, since it's very hard to narrow it down to just one memory, is that there was a point where anybody who spent more than just a passing amount of time around Greg got to just see the regular side of Greg. And the regular side of Greg, because he was interested in so many things, he was just fun to be around as just a regular person. A lot of people, me included, when I first met him, you think he's a rock
right.
star,
He's
role
Greg
playing
Stafford.
game. Yeah, he's a big fish, I'm nobody, all that type of thing. And because he never treated people like I'm some big rock star, and where's my crystal bowl full of green M&Ms or anything like that. It was just regular stuff. He'd be happy to go out to eat with people, just sit down and chat about stuff, chat about what you were working on. You know, if, if my kids had an interest in X or Y or Z, be it stamp collecting, he'd help with that. My wife and her fish tank, because he
Hmm.
had an interest in fish, he'd help with her fish tank. I was into Boy Scouts. I still am a Scoutmaster. Greg was into Scouts, so we talk about that. It wasn't just let me tell you about what I'm working on for my latest big RPG product. It was that, Greg had such a wide variety of interests, and you could relate to him on a wide variety of things, not just that one big thing of, hey, Greg, tell me something cool about what you're working on. It was, just everyday slice of life things. That was the part of the friendship that really uh, enriched everything. It
Yeah.
wasn't just business. It wasn't just some big project. It was just regular life, and his, huge appetite for it all the way to the end.
Well, I gotta say, as a fan of Greg Stafford and the games that he created, I'm always thrilled to sit down and talk with you, Rick. I appreciate that you're always open to doing an interview, but I'm also just grateful as a fan that Chaosium is being run by fans and people who knew and loved Greg, and so that is a rarity in kind of the modern, as I said, kind of in the modern gaming landscape. And I'm very grateful that uh, all of your luck rolls at the various stages that we talked about in the first part of the interview just kept working. Kind of, all these little pieces that came together, and now have you and Mob and Jeff and Neil kind of where you're at. Because again, the quality and the beauty that's coming out of Chaosium is just spectacular.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's certainly great to be a part of it.
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, there are times I got to interview two of my favorite authors last week, Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont of the Malazan series. And there are times where I get to talk with you, or I get to talk with a variety of different people, and somewhere in the back of my mind, that part of my brain that's still 12 and 13-year-old JM just can't believe that I'm getting to like hang out and talk with you know these people about the things that I love. And I can't imagine what teenage Rick living in your head, who is now president of Chaos, is
Oh yeah,
sort of.
no, my gaming buddies, two of which are still alive. One unfortunately has passed away, but he was alive when I got my job at Chaosium. He was like, him, you, Rick, you got a job at Chaosium? I was the last of the four guys at the table he thought I was gonna. He's like, why couldn't I get a job like that? And so yeah, no, none of my gaming group from back in the day that we played RuneQuest second edition together and played Call of Cthulhu together and
Yeah.
Stormbringer together and so on. When they found out I got the job, they were like, whoa, that wasn't expected. But they're certainly happy to see the company doing well, and I'm certainly happy to be a part of helping get it to where it is today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll be back with more beyond the table stories about the games we play in next year. I've got a lineup for the first 3 months, probably about two interviews a month. So looking forward to that. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in and joined us. And Rick, as always, thanks for hanging out.
Oh, my pleasure. I look forward to the next time we get to chat about stuff.
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be many more, hopefully. So, all right, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM, and this has been Beyond the Table. Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.